Most people hear the term Army Division and imagine a single battlefield formation. One commander, one patch, one block of troops moving as a unified force. In reality, a US Army division is less like a single combat unit and more like a modular command system. It is a headquarters, a planning architecture, a logistical framework, and a combat identity all at once. Some divisions are built for armored warfare. Some are optimized for air assault, Arctic operations, Pacific mobility, or rapid deployment. And some exist primarily to command, coordinate, and scale other formations rather than to fight as one permanently fixed body. That distinction matters because the modern army does not organize itself around tradition alone. Division names carry famous histories, but their present-day function is shaped by geography, technology, doctrine, and strategic demand. A divisions may preserve a World War II lineage while serving a very modern purpose, deterring North Korea, supporting Pacific exercises, testing new combat systems, or maintaining a rapid global response posture. The title stays familiar. The machinery behind it evolves. This is what makes the Army's divisional structure so revealing. It shows how the United States prepares for very different kinds of conflict at the same time. Heavy divisions centered on tanks and mechanized infantry are designed for large-scale ground combat. Light formations emphasize speed, flexibility, and difficult terrain. Airborne and air assault units are built to arrive fast and seize key positions. National Guard divisions add another layer, connecting state-based forces to federal war plans and domestic emergency response. Seen from a distance, these formations can look like a list of famous names and insignia. Up close, they form a map of American military priorities. Each division tells a different story about how the Army expects to move, fight, supply, command, and deter. To understand how the institution actually works, the first question is not which division is the most famous. It is how the Army funds, equips, and sustains such radically different formations under one system. To understand what these divisions can actually do, the first place to look is not the battlefield. It is the resource system behind them. A division's combat power begins long before deployment. Inside a funding structure that determines how many troops it can sustain, what vehicles it can maintain, how often it can train, and how quickly it can move from a peacetime posture to operational readiness. At the top level, Army divisions do not function as self-financing institutions. They are resourced through a much larger budgeting process that runs from Congress to the Department of Defense, then through the Department of the Army, major commands, and installation-level support networks. That means a division's strength is shaped by decisions made far above its own headquarters. End strength targets, procurement priorities, maintenance backlogs, fuel costs, ammunition stockpiles, and modernization programs all influence what that formation can realistically do in a crisis. This is why two divisions may share the same organizational label while operating with very different practical advantages. An armored division requires enormous investment in tracked vehicles, spare parts, depot repair capacity, transport equipment, and high-volume fuel distribution. A light infantry division demands less heavy equipment, but it still depends on sustained spending for air mobility, communications, medical support, and training rotations. In other words, lighter does not mean cheap. It means the cost is distributed differently across the system. A useful example is the Army's repeated modernization cycles after the Cold War, during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now during the renewed focus on large-scale competition. Divisions were not simply renamed or repositioned. They were gradually reweighted through equipment upgrades, force redesign, and shifting readiness priorities. Funding changed the force's character before strategy ever appeared in a public speech. So before a division can command brigades, deploy overseas, or deter an adversary, it has to exist as a funded institution with personnel, equipment, and sustainment built into place. But money alone does not create combat effectiveness. To turn resources into action, the Army needs a strict command structure that tells every division where it fits, who it answers to, and how it fights. A division's effectiveness depends on far more than its name or equipment. It depends on where that formation sits inside the Army's command hierarchy. A division is not an independent military actor. It is one layer inside a much larger chain of command that connects national political authority to operational control on the ground. That hierarchy determines who gives orders, how missions are assigned, and how combat power is coordinated across entire theaters. At the highest level, military authority flows from the President and Secretary of Defense through the combatant commands, which oversee broad geographic or functional missions. The Army then provides forces to those commands through its own service structure. Inside that framework, divisions usually operate as headquarters designed to command multiple brigades and supporting units. They translate strategic direction into practical battlefield organization. That means a division commander is not simply leading troops forward. That commander is synchronizing fires, intelligence, logistics, air defense, engineering, and movement across a large formation that may be spread over a wide area. This structure became even more important as the Army shifted toward brigade-centered operations in the early 21st century. Brigades became the main standardized combat packages for deployment, but divisions did not disappear. Instead, their role evolved. Division headquarters became critical coordinating nodes, especially for larger campaigns where multiple brigades had to operate together under a unified plan. In effect, the brigade became the core fighting bloc, while the division became the system that made multiple fighting blocks function coherently. That distinction has strategic consequences. A brigade can win a tactical engagement. A division headquarters helps organize a sustained campaign. It can set priorities, allocate support, manage tempo, and integrate attached forces that do not permanently belong to the same formation. In modern war, that orchestration is often what separates isolated action from meaningful operational success. So once the Army has funded and structured a division, the next question is how that headquarters turns doctrine into a real force package. Because a division does not fight with a title alone. It fights through subordinate formations built for very different kinds of missions. A division becomes real through the formations underneath it. On paper, the division is a headquarters. In practice, its power comes from the brigades, battalions, and support elements it can direct. This is where the Army's structure becomes more modular than many people realize. Modern divisions are not built as rigid, permanent blocks. They are designed to command different combinations of units depending on the mission, terrain, and threat. The central building block is usually the Brigade Combat Team. These brigades come in different forms, and each one changes the division's character. Armored Brigade Combat Teams bring tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, heavy artillery, and the sustainment burden that comes with them. Infantry Brigade Combat Teams trade armor for lighter mobility and flexibility, making them easier to deploy into rough terrain or less developed infrastructure. Stryker Brigade Combat Teams sit between those poles, using wheeled armored vehicles to balance protection, speed, and operational reach. A division built around one type will fight differently from a division built around another. But brigades are only the beginning. Divisions also rely on combat aviation, field artillery, engineers, air defense, signals, intelligence, and sustainment formations. Some are assigned permanently, others are attached when needed. That means a division can expand beyond its peacetime shape. In a crisis, it may receive extra fires units, logistics nodes, or aviation assets to support a larger campaign. Its combat profile is therefore not fixed. It is assembled through force packages. A clear example of this modular logic emerged during the Army's transition after the Cold War. Instead of organizing everything around static divisions with identical internal layouts, the Army increasingly emphasized flexible brigade formations that could be grouped under division headquarters as required. That gave planners more options. A division could be tailored for desert warfare, mountain operations, deterrence missions, or high-intensity armored combat without rewriting the entire institution from scratch. So the real question is not just how many divisions the Army has. It is what kinds of brigades and support units each division can pull together. And once those formations exist on paper, they still need something equally important before they can function: people trained to operate this system under pressure. Equipment and organizational charts do not make a division effective by themselves. The Army has to turn those assets into coordinated human performance, and that happens through training. A division is only as credible as its ability to move thousands of people through a common doctrine, a shared command language, and repeated rehearsals that prepare units to operate together under stress. That training happens in layers. Individual soldiers first learn their military specialty, whether that means infantry tactics, communications, intelligence analysis, vehicle maintenance, artillery fire direction, or medical care. They then move into collective training at the squad, platoon, company, and battalion levels. By the time a division is preparing for a major exercise or deployment, the real challenge is not teaching basic tasks. It is integrating many specialized units into one operational rhythm. This is where the Army's combat training centers become so important. Rotations at places like the National Training Center and Joint Readiness Training Center are designed to expose brigades and headquarters to realistic battlefield pressure. Units face simulated enemy forces, electronic disruption, reconnaissance threats, artillery strikes, logistical friction, and fast-changing mission requirements. The goal is not simply to test bravery. It is to expose coordination failures before they matter in a real conflict. For divisions, these events are especially valuable because they force large headquarters to practice command at scale. Staff officers must process intelligence, issue orders, allocate sustainment, and adjust to setbacks in real time. A division that looks fully manned on paper can still underperform if its staff processes are slow, its subordinate units do not share the same operational assumptions, or its communication systems break down under pressure. The post-2001 era demonstrated how training priorities can reshape the force. Divisions and brigades spent years preparing for counterinsurgency, stability operations, and repeated deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. More recently, training has shifted back toward large-scale combat, contested logistics, long-range fires, and operations against more advanced adversaries. That change reflects a broader truth. Training is where strategy becomes muscle memory. But even well-trained formations cannot operate effectively without tools built for the missions they are expected to perform. Once the army has people and doctrine aligned, the next layer is technology, the equipment, networks, and battlefield systems that give one division a very different reach from another. To understand why one division moves differently from another, it is necessary to look at technology as an operational system rather than a collection of weapons. The Army does not simply equip divisions with vehicles and radios. It builds each formation around a technical profile that shapes how it sees the battlefield, how far it can strike, how quickly it can maneuver, and how much support it requires to stay effective. In an armored division, technology is concentrated in heavy platforms and the network that sustains them. Tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery, recovery vehicles, and engineering systems create a formation built for protection, firepower, and shock action. But that strength comes with mechanical complexity. These divisions consume large volumes of fuel, require constant maintenance, and depend on robust transport and repair capacity. Their advantage is not just raw force. It is the ability to survive, maneuver, and deliver coordinated fires in high-intensity ground combat. Light and airborne divisions rely on a different technical logic. They use less armor, but they depend more heavily on mobility, communications, portable precision fires, aviation access, and rapid insertion capability. Their equipment is chosen to reduce deployment time and increase flexibility across difficult terrain. That makes them especially useful for forcible entry, crisis response, and operations where speed matters more than heavy protection. The trade-off is obvious. They can arrive fast, but they are more dependent on support if facing a heavily mechanized opponent. Across all division types, digital systems now matter almost as much as physical hardware. Tactical networks, battlefield management software, drones, sensors, satellite links, and precision targeting tools allow commanders to connect reconnaissance, fires, logistics, and maneuver more quickly than in earlier eras. Recent modernization efforts have focused heavily on this layer because future conflicts may depend as much on information flow and electronic resilience as on armor thickness or troop numbers. This is why technology does not simply make divisions stronger. It makes them different. It defines tempo, reach, visibility, and vulnerability. But no matter how advanced the equipment becomes, every division still runs into the same limiting factor once operations begin: sustaining movement, fuel, ammunition, and repairs over distance. And that brings the system to its most demanding test: logistics. The point where every division becomes vulnerable is logistics. Public attention usually goes to tanks, helicopters, elite troops, or battlefield tactics. But divisions do not remain effective because of what they can destroy. They remain effective because the army can keep them fueled, armed, repaired, fed, and medically supported while moving across long distances under difficult conditions. This is especially important because divisions consume resources at very different rates. An armored formation can burn through fuel and spare parts at a pace that turns every advance into a supply problem. A light infantry division may require less heavy maintenance, but it still depends on steady flows of ammunition, communications equipment, transport, rations, and casualty evacuation. In both cases, the question is the same: not just whether the division can fight today, but whether it can still fight after days or weeks of continuous operations. That burden falls on a layered sustainment system. Supply units move fuel, food, and ammunition forward. Maintenance teams recover damaged vehicles and return equipment to service. Medical networks stabilize the wounded and move them through evacuation channels. Engineers keep routes open. while transport assets link ports, depots, railheads, airfields, and frontline positions. Much of this work happens far from public view, but it determines the real endurance of the force. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan offered one model of sustainment, built around major bases, protected supply lines, and long-term, rotational infrastructure. A future large-scale conflict against a more capable adversary would look very different. Supply convoys could be targeted, ports and airfields could be threatened, communications could be disrupted. In that environment, logistics is no longer a background function. It becomes a contested battlefield in its own right. That is why divisions are judged not only by combat strength, but by how resiliently they can sustain tempo under pressure. A formation that outruns its supplies loses combat value quickly, no matter how advanced its weapons may be. And to avoid that breakdown, the army depends on something just as critical as trucks and depots: intelligence that tells commanders where risk is building before the system begins to fail. Even the best supplied division cannot operate well if it is blind. Once units spread across a battlefield, commanders need a constant stream of information about enemy positions, terrain, electronic activity, weather, civilian patterns, and the condition of their own force. That is why intelligence is not a separate world sitting outside divisional operations. It is built directly into how a division plans, moves, and prioritizes risk. At the division level, intelligence works as a fusion process. Information comes from scouts, drones, signals, intercepts, satellite support, higher headquarters, adjacent units, aviation assets, and open-source reporting. On their own, these inputs can be fragmented or misleading. The division staff has to combine them into something operationally useful: where the threat is massing, what routes are exposed, which targets matter most, and where friendly forces are becoming vulnerable. Intelligence is valuable not because it produces facts in isolation, but because it helps convert uncertainty into decisions. This function has become far more complex in the digital era. Modern divisions may face adversaries that use deception, camouflage, cyber disruption, electromagnetic interference, and long-range surveillance to distort the picture. That means intelligence is no longer just about finding the enemy. It is also about identifying what information can still be trusted when networks are disrupted and battlefield signatures are constantly changing. A division that misreads the environment can waste ammunition, expose supply lines, or maneuver into a stronger defense than expected. Operational history shows how decisive this layer can be. In earlier wars, divisions relied heavily on reconnaissance patrols, map analysis, and slower reporting cycles. Today, commanders often receive far more data, but more data does not automatically mean more clarity. The challenge is filtering, prioritizing, and acting fast enough to matter. That is now one of the defining tasks of a modern division headquarters. In other words, intelligence gives a division awareness, but awareness alone does not create combat effect. Once commanders understand the battlefield, they still have to shape it. And that leads to the next layer of divisional power: fires, the artillery, rockets, aviation, and strike systems that translate information into force across distance. Once a division can see the battlefield, the next question is how it exerts pressure across it. That is the role of fires. In Army terms, fires are not just artillery shells landing on a target. They are the coordinated use of cannons, rockets, missiles, mortars, attack aviation, and targeting networks to disrupt, suppress, and shape enemy action before close combat forces even arrive. At the division level, fires are both a weapon and a planning function. Commanders use them to isolate sectors, destroy defensive positions, interrupt logistics, protect maneuver corridors, and force opponents to react on unfavorable terms. This makes divisional combat less linear than many people imagine. Infantry and armor are not supposed to move blindly into resistance. Ideally, the battlefield is prepared first through a sequence of target identification, prioritization, and timed strikes that reduce the enemy's ability to respond effectively. This process requires tight coordination. Intelligence identifies likely targets. Fire support teams validate them. Command posts assign priorities based on the broader plan. Artillery units, rocket batteries, aviation elements, and sometimes joint assets then deliver effects in sequence. Timing matters as much as firepower. A strike that lands too early gives the enemy time to recover. Too late, and friendly forces may already be exposed. The real skill is integration. The Army's recent doctrinal shift back toward large-scale combat has made this even more important. After years focused heavily on counterinsurgency, divisions are once again emphasizing long-range fires, deep targeting, and the ability to strike command nodes, air defenses, and logistics networks far beyond the immediate front line. That reflects a basic lesson of modern warfare. The side that can shape depth, not just the front, gains a major operational advantage. But fires do not operate in isolation. A division can disrupt an enemy across distance, yet still fail if it cannot physically reposition forces to exploit those effects. That is why the next layer is maneuver, the coordinated movement of brigades, vehicles, aircraft, and support units that turns battlefield pressure into territorial control and operational momentum. A division's power is only theoretical until it can move. Maneuver is the layer where planning, fires, intelligence, and logistics are converted into physical advantage on the ground. It is not simply movement from one place to another. It is the controlled positioning of combat power to create pressure, exploit weakness, secure terrain, and force the enemy into increasingly unfavorable choices. At the divisional level, maneuver is far more than frontline motion. It involves sequencing multiple brigades, synchronizing routes, protecting flanks, positioning artillery, integrating aviation, and ensuring that sustainment keeps pace with the advance. A division headquarters has to decide not only where units should go, but in what order, with what support, and under what risk conditions. Poor maneuver can waste combat power. Effective maneuver can make even a strong defense unravel by threatening command nodes, supply lines, or escape routes. Different divisions approach this problem in different ways. An armored formation uses protected mobility and concentrated force to penetrate, exploit, and maintain momentum. A light infantry division often relies more on terrain, dispersed movement, helicopter support, and speed of insertion. Airborne or air assault formations may seize key bridges, airfields, or choke points before heavier forces arrive. The common principle is not identical movement. It is the ability to place force where it matters most, faster than the enemy can reorganize. This is where operational history becomes especially revealing. During earlier eras, divisions often maneuvered through clearer front lines and more predictable support corridors. In a modern conflict, movement may be tracked by drones, threatened by long-range fires, and disrupted by electronic warfare. That makes concealment, dispersion, deception, and route flexibility far more important than in the past. Maneuver is no longer just about massing power. It is about moving power without becoming an easy target. Once a division can move effectively, it becomes a true operational instrument, rather than a static formation. But mobility, by itself, does not guarantee reach. To sustain pressure across regions and respond to sudden crises, the Army needs another layer beyond battlefield maneuver. Deployment infrastructure, the ports, aircraft, ships, rail systems, and prepositioned networks that move divisions from home station to war zone in the first place. A division does not become strategically useful simply because it can fight well once it arrives. It becomes useful when the United States can move it where it is needed, at the scale required, and fast enough to influence events before a crisis hardens. That is why deployment infrastructure is one of the least visible but most important parts of the entire divisional system. Most divisions are stationed far from the locations where they would likely be used. Moving them requires a vast transportation architecture that connects bases to rail lines, airfields, ports, sea lift, prepositioned stock, and host nation infrastructure overseas. Heavy formations in particular cannot rely on speed alone. Tanks, tracked vehicles, ammunition, fuel equipment, repair systems, and support vehicles create a movement problem that extends far beyond the division headquarters. Strategic mobility is therefore not just about aircraft or ships. It is about the national capacity to assemble lift, protect transit routes, receive forces abroad, and transition them into combat-ready posture. This is where different types of divisions reveal very different advantages. Airborne and light formations can deploy rapidly, making them valuable for immediate response, deterrent signaling, or early entry missions. Heavy armored divisions are slower to move, but once in theater, they deliver far greater sustained ground combat power. That trade-off has shaped Army planning for decades. In many scenarios, lighter forces are expected to arrive first, secure key positions, and buy time for heavier units to follow through maritime transport and large-scale reception networks. The logic can be seen in long-standing U.S. military posture in Europe, the Middle East, and the Pacific. Prepositioned equipment sets, rotational deployments, and multinational exercises are designed to reduce the time between political decision and operational capability. They do not eliminate the deployment challenge, but they compress it. In strategic terms, that compression can be the difference between deterrence and delayed reaction. So a division is not just a battlefield organization. It is also a deployable package inside a global movement system. And once those forces arrive, another layer becomes decisive immediately: regional alignment, because divisions do not enter empty space. They enter alliances, commands, climates, and threat environments that shape how each formation is actually used. Even after a division is funded, trained, equipped, and deployed, its usefulness still depends on where it is placed in the world. Geography changes everything. Mountain terrain, island chains, frozen environments, dense cities, open deserts, and allied border zones all impose different demands on the same organization. That is why divisions are not only warfighting formations, they are also regionally relevant tools shaped by climate, distance, infrastructure, and alliance commitments. This is one reason the Army maintains divisions with distinct operating identities. A formation associated with the Pacific has to think about long distances, maritime choke points, dispersed basing, and the difficulty of sustaining forces across islands or coastal regions. A division aligned with Europe has to prepare for rail movement, NATO coordination, prepositioned stocks, and the possibility of large-scale land warfare on a heavily networked continent. Units focused on the Arctic or northern environments face a completely different problem set involving cold weather mobility, survival, equipment reliability, and sparse infrastructure. Regional alignment also changes the political dimension of how divisions are used. In many cases, their role is not to fight immediately, but to reassure allies, build interoperability, and signal commitment. Exercises, rotational deployments, staff integration, and joint planning all serve that purpose. A division headquarters can become strategically important before combat begins simply by helping allied militaries train together under a shared operational framework. In that sense, divisions are instruments of deterrence as much as instruments of war. The shift in U.S. defense planning over the last decade has reinforced this pattern. As attention moved away from a primary focus on counterinsurgency and back toward competition with major powers, regional posture became more important again. Divisions are now judged not only by internal readiness, but by how well they fit into theater-specific plans involving partners, terrain, and contested access. So the Army's divisions are best understood as globally positioned command systems adapted to different strategic environments. But even that is not the final layer. Once geography, alliances, and theater posture are in place, the real test becomes institutional adaptation, how these formations change when doctrine, technology, and the character of war begin shifting again. What makes Army divisions truly revealing is that they are never finished products. They are institutional frameworks that keep being redesigned as threats, doctrine, and technology change. A division may preserve its historic insignia for decades, but the way it fights, deploys, communicates, and sustains itself can shift dramatically within a single generation. In that sense, divisions are not static relics of past wars. They are living indicators of how the Army is adapting to the next one. This pattern has repeated several times in modern history. During the Cold War, many divisions were oriented toward large-scale conventional conflict in Europe, with heavy formations positioned for high-intensity combat against a peer land force. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the Army adjusted toward contingency operations, regional interventions, and a smaller but still globally deployable force. Following the attacks of September 11, 2001, divisions and their subordinate formations spent years focused on counterinsurgency, stability operations, and long rotational campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, the emphasis has shifted again toward large-scale combat operations, long-range precision fires, air and missile threats, electronic warfare, and contested logistics. That cycle of adaptation affects everything inside the division. Training standards change. Equipment priorities shift. Headquarters refine how they command dispersed units. Intelligence staffs learn to operate in more contested information environments. Sustainment planners prepare for disrupted supply lines rather than protected rear areas. Even the mix of assigned brigades and attached support units can be rethought to fit a new strategic environment. The division remains the same institution in name, but not in operational design. This is why Army divisions matter beyond their troop numbers or historic reputation. They show how a military bureaucracy converts strategic warning into structural change. If global conditions evolve, divisions evolve with them. And that leads directly to the final question. Once all these layers are combined, funding, command, brigades, training, technology, logistics, intelligence, fires, maneuver, deployment, and regional posture, what role do divisions actually play in the broader American system of power today and what pressures are likely to reshape them next. In the end, an army division is best understood not as a famous patch or a fixed number of troops, but as a strategic instrument that connects national power to organized land force. It sits at the point where policy, budget, doctrine, industry, training, logistics, and combat planning all converge. That is why divisions remain important, even in an era shaped by satellites, cyber operations, precision weapons, and long-range strike. They are still the structures through which the Army turns national intent into sustained operational presence on the ground. Their role in the modern system is broader than winning battles alone. Divisions help deter conflict by existing in credible form, by deploying visibly, by integrating with allies, and by signaling that the United States can scale land power if a crisis grows. They provide command frameworks for brigades, aviation, artillery, sustainment, and attached multinational forces. In peacetime, they organize exercises, posture forces, and build interoperability. In war, they become the headquarters that holds complex campaigns together over time and distance. That makes divisions part of a larger geopolitical ecosystem. In Europe, they reinforce alliance credibility and large-scale deterrence. In the Indo-Pacific, they contribute to dispersed posture, theater coordination, and the challenge of operating across vast distances. In domestic terms, National Guard divisional structures also reflect the way military readiness intersects with state responsibilities and federal mobilization. Different divisions serve different purposes, but all of them reveal how the Army distributes capability across a wide strategic map. The future challenge is adaptation under pressure. Divisions will have to operate in environments where communications are degraded, supply networks are targeted, drones are widespread, and long-range surveillance makes concentration more dangerous. They may need to become more dispersed, more digitally resilient, and more flexible in how they combine fires, maneuver, and sustainment. Their historic identities will remain, but their methods will keep changing. So the real story of U.S. Army divisions is not just who they are. It is how they function as evolving command systems inside a global architecture of deterrence, deployment, and land warfare. And that is what makes them so important. They are not symbols of past power, but working frameworks for how American military force is organized for the conflicts and uncertainties ahead.